Welcome to the Growth Over Grades podcast, a show connecting you with thought leaders, pioneers, and change agents who are leading the charge to support schools and districts making the shift toward competency-based education and to promote growth over grades. I'm Jordan Lewis, and on the show today, we have systems transformer and former director of innovative learning for the Kentucky Department of Education, David Cook. David thrives in the space of helping systems shift to an ecosystem culture with an asset mindset rather than a deficit one. After a successful 27-year career working in the Kentucky Department of Education, the last 15 as the Director of Learning Innovation, David helped lead systematic change, including authoring Kentucky's Education Recovery Program, designing the longest operating statewide remote learning system in America, helping direct Kentucky's development of the statewide Portrait of a Learner, and sowing the seeds for a statewide shift in assessment, accountability, and credentialing, moving from a one-size-fits-all approach to one that emphasizes community involvement and how mastery is measured. Today, we've dived deep into transformational initiatives to help districts push forward and create student-centered ecosystems. David shares strategies for districts to launch a Portrait of a Graduate and how to use this as a guiding North Star towards stronger instructional changes and the power of performance-based assessments to better understand student growth. Now, to my conversation with David Cook. All right, David, super excited to have you here on the show today. I'm really excited for today's episode specifically because we're going to be talking a lot about system transformation, and a lot of what school districts are ruminating about right now is this desire, this need to transform a traditional outdated system. So I'm super excited to talk through some of these things here today with you. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Great to be here, Jordan.
So, David, to kind of kick things off, we know that there are a lot of challenges in any sort of system transformation, but a core challenge that we keep hearing about in a system transformation is moving from compliance to culture. And this is very pertinent when we talk about any sort of transformation, but a lot of this is happening when we see districts wanting to really move to their Portrait of a Graduate. So I'm curious, as we kind of kick off the conversation, what sort of district level policies or changes are you seeing become essential to help bring this Portrait of a Graduate to life? So that way we make sure it's not just about a compliance hitting a checkbox, but it becomes part of the culture of the district.
Yeah, I think, Jordan, there's a couple of things I would really focus on. And I think the most important thing is that question of how did that school system develop their portrait? Because I think at the heart of real system transformation is the understanding that you don't just do it inside the district or the school system. You do it from the community level too. And I'm not just talking about community involvement. Talking about actual community engagement. When I look at the work that we've done in Kentucky, it all started from local communities bringing together a coalition of their stakeholders that included parents, that included business people, that included faith leaders, everything. And really sitting down and saying, what is it we need our students to be able to do? How are we going to best prepare them for their future? And when you do that, you have automatically done something different than what the current system does. The current system is a very top-down, very sort of inside-out approach to policy development, because it's about, this is what we're going to do, this is what's most efficient, this is what works the best, do it. It's sort of that idea. What we're having happen is all these people are starting to develop these wonderful portraits, and they don't have the support they need to implement them. So the second thing I think that's really crucial is you have to have a conversation about your accountability system. And you have to ask yourself, does it align to what we really want kids to know and be able to do? If that includes a portrait or competency framework of any kind, then you better start thinking about, as a system, are you ready to measure, to to incorporate that stuff that you have worked so hard in developing your portrait into your accountability model. And if you're not, if you're going to simply have an accountability system which measures the things we've measured for 130 years, it's not going to support your teachers and your principals who are working their tails off to get a new way of thinking about their classrooms. And they're really diving into developing their portrait. So they're doing it at the classroom level, but a lot of times it's misaligned to what the district or the system, the state, whoever it might be, is saying is important. When you see what happens when teachers and principals are basically told, this stuff you're doing now matters in our accountability model, that's when the change happens. Because when a teacher believes that I'm not just doing this because it's great and it's fun and I love working with my students on this, when they look up one day and go, wow, this is going to count toward our accountability score or whatever the thing is that the system is doing, it changes the way they think about it. It gives them a sense of ownership, and it changes all of their approach to implementing those portrait competencies. So I think it's a recognition that our system is still living in a time when the things and the ways that we taught kids and the things that we felt were important were different. I think all of the things that we do from a content basis are important, but what the portrait's doing is it's allowing us to really focus more on how kids learn rather than just what they learn. So
I think that's a really important distinction, the how kids learn versus what it is that they learn. And I feel that's the starting place of a massive mindset shift. Now, where I see a lot of districts struggling is engaging the community to also understand that. You can get teachers and faculty who buy in and who understand that. When we're talking about this culture, David, it has to extend into the community as well. So there is a community education perspective, which can be really challenging for districts to support. Have you seen any work done to help that community sort of value these new methods of measurement and what we as a system are saying is actually critical, where they may be looking at purely those transcripts or the grades that they grew up understanding?
Yeah, I think, and I sort of mentioned it briefly in my first response. I think where it's not just about getting that engagement with the community and sharing that work, it's at what level at what time do you incorporate the community into your conversation? I think what's happened in Kentucky particularly is with these local laboratories of learning, we call them. There's 17 districts that several years ago jumped on board with us. And the whole intention of that work was you're required as a participant in this program to identify a community coalition. And from the get-go, before you even mention the word portrait, you're going to sit down with these people and say, what is it that you think your kids aren't getting that they need? And here's the important thing. Almost always, the list of notes that somebody took in those community meetings, you take that list and you lay it against what most portrait competencies are, and that's what they are.
Right.
It's not that people aren't saying, my kids aren't getting their math content, my kids aren't learning how to read. It's that they don't feel like their kids know what to do with all of that knowledge that they're gaining. They're not being asked to apply that knowledge, and teachers aren't. It's a shift in the dynamic of the teacher in the classroom. We've talked for a lot of years in this circle that you and I both live in about what's important and what teachers' job is. And we've sort of used this phrase for a long time, in my opinion, of facilitating learning. So that's what a teacher's really doing. And when we get the mindset shift towards application of knowledge and teachers facilitating learning doesn't mean that the stuff before that is not important. The question is what the portrait does is it shifts what we think should be made public and what we think should be the real things that we're measuring that parents can see and look at. So they can, as we develop these systems, as we develop tools, what we're giving them is this is what it looks like for a kid to be a critical thinker. This is what it looks like for a kid to be a collaborator. And we have it at all levels of the system, from elementary school all the way through high school. And it's creating this change, this mindset shift. But the bottom line is it all has to start. You can't just say, we've made a decision to create a portrait. We've asked a few teachers to join us on the development of this thing. And now we're going to have to sell that to everybody. If you walk into your classrooms and you walk into your community centers and you walk into the supermarket and you walk into places of worship, whatever it is you're talking about, and you start asking people just really simple questions, the original step in the process in Kentucky were town hall meetings in which two questions were asked, just two. What is it that you got out of the system, per stakeholder person, whoever you are, parent, grandparent, whatever, and what do you want your kids and grandkids to get out of the system? And the difference in those two things is where we built the system. It's, oh, yeah, our kids need this. And then when you let those local communities design that part of the structure, the great thing about it is, Jordan, is you're not saying, oh, well, yeah, we're against the measuring of math and reading and writing and social studies and science and all that. No, there's more. And that's what we're trying to look at, is what's more and what really gets at did that kid learn the content that we shared with them? Did they actually, or can they use it on a day-to-day basis?
And hearing you speak just about, the role of community in this, I love those two questions, what you got out of the system and then what you want your grandkids or your children to have out of the system, because it really paints the picture of how different the world is to when they were in school, which I do feel is a big blocker, because for so long, families were, and teachers for that matter, were sort of gatekeepers to that next step, gatekeepers of knowledge and information. And when we think about how this layers into future readiness frameworks, we need students to develop these because it's going to help. But prior to, this advanced technology and the world of the internet and all that sort of stuff, you would go to those trusted adults to say, okay, what next, right? But now it's rapidly evolving. It's moving so quickly. Students can find out any information at the click of a mouse. And now I feel like parents may struggle a little bit because they're no longer the gatekeepers. And we know that teachers have struggled with that role shift of what it looks like in their classroom. But I feel like families are also trying to figure out how they interplay in this, which is not an easy shift. And I feel like it often falls on almost the responsibility of the district to also kind of support and manage that. Whereas, is that the responsibility of the district? It becomes hard for our leaders when they're trying to get this buy-in.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think all these role shifts are a challenge to the system and a challenge to the transformation. And I think sometimes we overdo it. And I think in some situations in Kentucky, in the early stages of this work, we talked about this shift of the community and how they're engaged in a process, and we gave too much of that over to the community, and they got to a place where they're like, that I can't do that. That's not me.
Right.
That's not us. So you do have to remember that there are certain parts of this where the traditional roles are the traditional roles, right? So it's a balancing act
Sure.
of thinking about those things. But I think at the end of the day, this idea of systems transformation requires us to look at these things and to figure out that balance. But again, it's sort of a paradigm shift from the system sort of saying this is what we're going to do and trying to get the people to buy in, to asking the people what's important, asking teachers, or saying, I know teachers, you're doing these great things in your classrooms. You're doing competency-based education. You're doing project-based learning. You're collecting things in a different way. How are we going to support that as the system? And so everybody's role has to shift, and it has to be about, and again, if you want to look at it in a different way, it's the shift from a transactional system to a relational system. Very different conversations. We are in a transactional system now. We do everything that we do, and the end goal is whatever the assessment is, or whatever the grade is, or whatever the thing is that we're trying to accomplish. And we dot, 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 dot. But we try constantly through professional development for teachers and all the work we do with teachers, training teachers, we want them to be relational. We want them to have relationships with their students and with other teachers and with their leaders. And it's all of this wonderful stuff is happening. And my fear is, Jordan, is that we're going to hit a wall pretty soon, where all of the schools that are progressive enough to implement these wonderful learner-centered kinds of things and to use the tools that are available to help them collect evidence of learning and all of that. But the problem is the system doesn't recognize that right now.
Right.
In Kentucky, we're making a huge shift. I mean, it's not like we don't have an example. Kentucky has legally modified their accountability system to incorporate the portrait into the process of accountability. That's a huge shift. That's obviously the biggest of all shifts. We can change assessment. We can change classroom practice. The system has to recognize that the things that are happening in classrooms are not going to spread to the extent we want them to, as long as traditional may not be the right word, but the way that a school that is rooted in the system is going to continue to do traditional things in classrooms because that's how their teachers are being, in essence, evaluated, right? They're being, are you getting the math score that I need you to get? Are you providing students with the stuff that the system says is important? Well, let's change what the system says is important, and then it will align to what the classroom is doing. So, yeah.
It's a really important call out, and we are seeing some really amazing shifts taking place with like what you just mentioned, things like teacher evaluation and districts evolving their portrait to say we're also going to have not only the portrait of a learner, but then the portrait of a teacher and the portrait of a community, and extending that work so that you can ensure that additional layer comes into play. But what I'm curious about, just to kind of take one step back before we take two steps forward, you were mentioning strategies like hosting town halls to engage the community members and getting buy-in and industry involved. And it's so critical to build this community around the portrait. But when we think about it in the buildings, we have our administrators and we have our staff, and we're trying to get their buy-in and helping them understand it's not just about compliance and there's the culture we're developing. what sort of strategies can leaders take to get them to buy in? And not only just about saying, hey, we have a portrait, we're going to build it, because that's step one, but we're actually going to implement it. We're going to infuse it into our instruction. Like what can leaders do to start having those shifts take place?
I think the first thing they can do is on a regular basis, consistently and constantly, tell their teachers and show their teachers that it actually is important to me as the administrator that we make this shift. Too often, I think teachers, you may come in and go, hey, we're going to try this new thing. And you go through a lot of training, and then you look up one day and the principal's worrying about something else. And they're not, as they do daily and weekly and monthly and annual and quarterly observations of teachers, they're not walking in with in essence, the attitude that what we've been giving all this PD on is really important. I think that often is one of the reasons why things don't take hold, is there's not a feeling, and that works its way up the system. I can tell you about superintendents in Kentucky, even ones that were involved in this local laboratories of learning project, who not until a year and a half into the work finally looked at me and said, okay, David, I think you all are actually going to do this, right? Because we stayed on course for that long. And I think it's got to be a situation where teachers believe it's not the next shiny object, that it's really something real. And the way they do that is by seeing leaders, principals, assistant principals, curriculum specialists, whoever it is, actually sort of leading in that way and saying, what you're doing is important. What you're doing is making a difference. What do we want to do next? Asking them the questions about what's working, what's not working. Let's have a pop-up PD because I've heard from 15 teachers that this isn't working. And sort of them seeing in their leaders the belief that this is really the thing, that we're not just, oh yeah, this is what the district wanted us to do this year, so we're going to do it.
Right.
It's seeing their leaders believe in it the way they believe in it.
And take it to the next level, and we see a lot and hear a lot about strategies where simple infusion techniques can come into play. I think, to celebrate what you just referenced, having the administrators participate is so critical. And you mentioned a little bit ago, the broader transformation is moving from the top down to a more involved method. But I think we can take it layers deeper. So if the administrators are really bought in it and they're reinforcing it, it's being spoken about in all staff meetings. We see a lot of principals doing, hallway walks or classroom walks with their teachers, like talking and infusing the competencies into those systems are so critical, and frankly, like not that challenging to do. If you're evaluating or exploring teachers and giving feedback on X, Y, and Z, add in the competencies and speak about it and infuse it and make it part of the culture. Like those are simple strategies you can literally start implementing tomorrow when you're going in and doing those things. But I think from the superintendent, assistant superintendent, central office staff's perspective, so often we hear they create the vision, they put the framework out, and then they just expect it to go, but they're not looking back to those administrators, the principals and assistant principals, or those teachers, and quarterly receiving feedback on what this is looking at, finding instructional gaps. And to your point that you've mentioned, when you don't have that full cycle happening, that's when it kind of takes on that, hey, maybe this is something that's going to go away in a few years, right?
Yeah. I absolutely, Jordan. And I think, again, what I described with the teacher and the principal relationship, again, to your point just now, then extends up the system, right? The leaders in the buildings, the school administrators, the principals, the other leaders have to feel the same level of confidence and the same level of support from the district staff that they're giving to their teachers. That's where it comes from. That I think if that principal feels supported, they're going to support because they see the district And to my point a minute ago about that superintendent I mentioned, if they feel supported by the state, the larger the people who are actually making the laws and making the rules that govern all of this stuff, it all makes sense and it all
Right.
works together to and then it's perfect at the school level. I was going to say one other thing about going back to that community aspect. If if the whole district is talking and speaking in a certain way related to the portrait, related to the classroom instructional models and how they support the portrait, then the community, if that's the way they talk. So as an example, what I was thinking about is if I'm having teacher conferences, parent teacher conferences, and those conferences are designed to talk about the portrait,
Right.
then you've done your job. You've incorporated all the, and when the superintendent goes and talks to the Chamber of Commerce or the whoever the local business community is, and he's talking about this portrait that those members of that Chamber of Commerce were involved in developing, everybody's then on the same page, so to speak, about this is what we value in our system, and we're going to don't worry tomorrow. And ideally, if you do it really well, if you have a change of administration at the top, that next person's going to come in the community, and the teachers and the principal, they're going to go, well, this is how we do things here.
Right.
It's that you've created a sustainable change, not just
Right.
a transformational change, but one that sort of is administration proof, if you will. It's like we're going to hire the next superintendent who believes the way we do, not somebody who's got a vision that we don't agree with.
Right.
It's
Of course.
yeah.
And as we're sort of, we're chatting about all of these kind of smaller critical changes that can start layering in transformation, we do need to consider and think about potential instructional shifts that have to come along with some of these things. And this is the point in the podcast. We're 25 minutes in for those people that are here thinking we're just talking big picture. No, we're going to get into the instructional shifts. And this is the scariest part for a lot of people is you've done the work. You've got the portrait. You have the graphic on the wall. Portrait of a learner, graduate, whatever you want to call it. You got the graphic. You got the community bought in. You have your families that are involved. On paper, everything looks like it's ready to go. But now you got to put it into practice. You got to start getting students to, show and document, and you need to really get it to work. That might have instructional shifts happening. So I know, David, we talked offline about layering content on top of competencies. So I'm really curious, kind of, when you think about what that means, like, what does it mean in your eyes to layer content on top of these competencies to help bring about some of these instructional shifts that's going to need to happen to really ingrain the competencies and the portrait into the school culture in the building?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that you have to remind yourself, and this is something that takes a long time in some of these shifts, and that is, I think there's a tendency to look at standards, curriculum standards, and competencies as two buckets that are not connected. So teachers look at themselves as deliverers of content, of curriculum, of standards that the state or whoever it is has decided they need to teach. And they say, oh yeah, then we've got this portrait thing, which is all this other stuff. And at the heart of that is a belief that we are a content-based system, and we may lay skills on top of that. We may try to attach skills in some additive way. So it's like the role is to get the content taught. And if we get lucky and we teach kids how to be communicators and how to be collaborators and critical thinkers, okay, that's wonderful. They in other words, their whole mindset is it's curriculum and it's the portrait. If we look at it from the standpoint that the curriculum is what we teach. And it's so important in the 21st century to recognize that what we teach is going to change tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day. But the competencies that fall into a framework like a portrait are the things that talk about how kids learn and the ways in which they learn and the things that they learn and develop, the skills, the mindsets, the habits, if you want to call them habits of mind or dispositions, the things that they learn about themselves and how they learn that prepares them for a future that doesn't look like it does today. Then if you've taught them how to be a learner, then tomorrow, if you give them new content, they can learn it.
Right.
So the shift that we're really talking about having teachers make is to think of those two things, the standards and the competencies, as complementary to each other, not as sort of isolated from each other. And the personal thing that I'm talking about is, so the paradigm shift is flipping the idea over that you mentioned in your question, which is, if we make the foundation the skills and the dispositions, the competencies, then we can lay on top of that whatever content it is that somebody's telling us kids need to have, whether that's a particular set of math skills or math standards, whether it's science standards. And the student's ability to adapt to all the new content comes from the fact that you taught them how to be a learner. And I think that's the shift in my estimation, is teachers thinking they're getting kids ready by giving them this set of credits that says they have all these things that the university wants or that the employer, to that a shift to, guess what I've done? I have helped create a learner that is prepared for their life after high school. And if I've done that, then it's going to be fun watching them as they develop their career and they develop all the things they're going to learn in life, because they can learn, and they can learn and adapt and be all the things that they need to be, instead of my job is simply to ensure that they graduated. That's what a guy that I've known for a long time, he used to be a local school board member. And I asked him one time, what does a diploma mean? And he said, it means they can't come back. That was his response. And he really was, he's being truthful about that. He was saying, we did what we were supposed to do under the state law, and we got them through these credits. They got passing grades, and they can't come back. We're done. We finished that process. And they may be ready or they may not be ready, but are they prepared? No. And this district was one of the first districts that sort of thought through a portrait in Kentucky. Right. And that was because they wanted the diploma to be something that meant something both to the learner and to the world outside, so that an employer who tells me every day, about 15 years ago in Kentucky, we brought together 20 HR directors. We said, why do you fire people? Universally, their answer was, because they don't know what to do when something goes wrong. Mm. I can teach them, if they're on a line worker in a factory, I can teach them the job. I can teach them the content they need to know. But if they don't know what to do when things go wrong with that content, then they're not really useful. And they have to be able to collaborate with their teammates, to critically think through problems and come up with solutions. So the world is living that way, right? The world is skills based. The world is performance based. When we talked earlier, we talked a little bit about evaluation. I don't know of an evaluation system in the world where the stuff that we would call sort of technical, like do you have good attendance at work? Do you take your breaks properly? Like my evaluations when I was at the Kentucky DOE, that was like 2% of the evaluation, right?
And
99,
now people don't
98%
even have to go
of
to an
the,
office. They're working from home.
right.
So it's like,
98% of the evaluation is, do you know how to do your job, and are you capable of all these things that occur when you're doing your job, and do you find ways to make things happen and make things work? So the world is performance based, but our system currently still believes in it being about, yeah, we count attendance for a lot of things in school systems. It's in the United States, it's the primary way we fund schools. Did you sit in a seat? And that's it. Yeah, it's important stuff, but it doesn't get us where we need to go, which is, are we preparing? I've learned in the last few years that word preparedness is becoming more of a thing. We in Kentucky, we actually, when we talk about the development of the portrait, we really use the phrase because we want a prepared graduate, not a ready graduate, but a prepared graduate. Because sometimes readiness, not all the time, but sometimes readiness is, I've checked off the boxes that I can do the next thing, as opposed to, I am someone who, if the next thing changed for me, I could do it. It's like I've prepared you for life, not just readied you for the future. I've prepared you for the future. So anyway, it's semantics. I know it's kind of a play on words, but it's an important thing that we did when we were developing the portrait, was to talk about preparedness, and are we preparing students for that?
well, I mean, even speaking of semantics, I feel like the fact that you don't call it a state portrait of a graduate, but it's a portrait of a learner, is a lot more all encompassing, right, David? And you were talking a little bit earlier about, as we're thinking about our instruction differently, you put the skills and competencies as the foundation and the content on top of it. A big struggle that a lot of folks I know have is they say, well, I'm getting this ninth grader. They've never been taught these skills, and now I'm expected to not only teach them the content that I have to teach because of state policy, but now also these skills. And that's why I love the work that's happening within Kentucky, because it starts with the mindset of, it's about the learner, not just the graduates. Because to me, yes, you can have that language of the portrait of a graduate, but it very much is a high school thing, and it kind of puts the onus on the high school. But the portrait of a learner now brings it to a system, K through to 12, pre-K 12 and beyond. Like it makes it for everybody. And then when you have those K to 3 students and you're teaching them the fundamentals of how to learn, what better place to lay that foundation than with that group of students, right? So as soon as you said that, I thought we got to unpack that a little bit, because I think it's so important when you hear from teachers that are struggling, especially when it's a high school only focus. Like, I would always say when I work with schools and they say, we don't have time for these things, the best way to combat time is to stretch your framework out over multiple years and give teachers less to do, but make it over a longer period of time. You're going to get the same outcomes. You're engaging more people, and now everybody's a little bit happier with the outcomes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. What a disservice to high school teachers to think about this whole conversation as if it starts in ninth grade. Um, And that's what was very important in Kentucky. I remember the process that we went through with a bunch of teachers from K to 12, from pre-K up. And the conversation was, these are not competencies that are high school competencies. They aren't a portrait of a graduate. They are a portrait of a learner. And what that means is, K3 teachers, we need to take the competencies that we've designed. Here's the competencies, the 6, the 8, the 10, whatever the number is. And we need to decide what it looks like for a second grader to be competent in this competency, to be a master of this competency. So one of the very first things we ever did was we created performance outcomes for the competencies across grade levels. So we said, it's not about here, because one of the things that our state board was like, we had this discussion with the State Board of Education about portrait of a graduate versus portrait of a learner. And it wasn't too hard to get them to realize what you just said, Jordan, which is it gives ownership to everybody if it's a portrait of a learner. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to say that if Jordan goes through this system in second grade, this is what he looks like if he's doing things well in the skills and dispositions that we've designed in the fourth grade. This is what it looks like when he's a fifth grader. This is what it looks like when he's an eighth grader. And your growth is that. It's so that when you get to 12th grade and the sort of technical, here's what it looks like thing for a 12th grader to have mastered a competency is a culmination of all of the work that you've done. It's sort of like we talk about sometimes defensives of learning. The defensive learning isn't just what I've done that year. It's a culmination of if we've done this right, then from the beginning to the point in time we do the defensive learning, there's something in there that's about the past, not just even though it's really focused on this is what I did this year. It's got to obviously have connotation that there's a foundation that's been laid so that when you got to this year, you were able to do the things that you need to do. And ultimately, again, I think if we do that, focus on those competencies and those skills every single time, every year, every working with students, looking at it from what does it look like for a kid in second grade versus a kid that's getting ready to graduate, and have they made that growth? And if we help them, as you pointed out, if we start that way in school, it's probably going to make the content application easier as well.
Right.
Because if we're really thinking about, somebody said one time, the way school ought to work is the whole first month ought to just be about, the teacher ought to be thinking, I am not going to open a textbook. The first 3 weeks of school is all about me helping kids learn each other, learn how to problem solve, learn how to collaborate, learn to communicate. Then I'll get the content in. And I bet you it's a whole lot easier to do the content if kids are already in the skills space, if you will, from the get-go. So.
Yeah, the whole idea of the starting off, not to change the topic and blow up what our focus is today. I love when I hear school systems that just run year round and they don't have the learning loss that they need to combat and all those things. That's for another episode entirely. Because if I had a magic wand and I was talking through system transformation, it would be to kind of implement what we've been talking about, but then also shift the whole, timelines of what our traditional school year looks like. But you just mentioned the defensive learning and that model, and there's a lot of different ways that it can be called for listeners out there. Defensive learning. I've heard demonstration of learning, student showcase. So just talk to us a little bit, David, about what a defensive learning is as a method of sort of checking in and measuring students' competency development.
Yeah, so it's one of, I think, a multiple number of performance-based assessment strategies that schools can use to better understand, and this is another part of the system shift, Jordan, is terminology shift away from assessing students to collecting evidence of learning. And when you ask a student in front of a group of both peers and teachers to explain in any number of ways, whether that's they've created a video that shows different things they've done, But what the defensive learning does is it shows me the process of learning. It takes me through all the steps I took to get to this place where we think there should be, from an academic content standpoint, from a learning standpoint, at the end of a period of time, most likely the end of a school year. And it's saying, this is what I did over the course of the year that demonstrates that I know the kinds of curriculum standard things I need to know for my grade level, but also shows I can show you how I applied this. I built this thing. I made this video. I interacted. I did a panel discussion with a bunch of other kids. I did all these different things. So the demonstration or the defensive learning is simply saying, I want to show you the process I took to get to the end result. And I think that's another huge part of the transformation shift is semantics or grammar definitions. It's a shift from the word learning as a noun, which is an event that happens in May of the school year when you take this big test, to learning as a verb, which is over the course of a year, the process I took to learn this stuff looked like this. So that's part of that huge transformation shift. So I think, again, is our systems in a general sense across the country, across Canada, whoever we're talking about, are they set up to measure, to assess learning as a activity, a transaction, or are they set up to collect evidence of learning as a process over time? And that's the shift. The shift is, again, it's back to, is the system aligned to the practice? So if you can get your teachers to have a mindset shift towards this idea of collecting evidence of learning, does the system support that? Is the system ready to, and in most cases it isn't, because it's still measuring on a date. You know, I'm always fascinated by how we create achievement gaps in our system. Because our achievement gaps are almost usually, here's the test we took on May 15th, and these kids did well and these kids didn't. And there's a gap. Well, of course there's a gap. Because on May 15th, every kid in the classroom wasn't at the same place in their learning process.
Sure.
So it's going to be that way, right? If that's how if you're transactional in nature, that's how you're going. That's what you're going to get. You're going to get created achievement gaps, because now, I'm not saying all achievement gaps are created. There are a whole bunch of other issues that relate to equity and all of that. And that's, again, another whole episode. But if you're not at the heart of what you do, trying to create a system that looks across all of a student's work from the day they started on a project to the day they ended it, you're not getting a full picture of what they learned. So we got to do that at the classroom level with teachers. We got to change their mindset. We got to change school leadership mindset. We got to change district leadership mindset. And we have to do like we've done in Kentucky, change state boards of education, commissioners of education, and state legislators to see that as well. And to say, we realize that local accountability and what local communities are bringing to the table as value, and we're going to build a system that recognizes that.
And it's interesting hearing you talk through the focus on the process and not making learning transactional. You know, it's something that I fundamentally believe whenever I talk to anybody about these shifts, and they say, well, how do we measure it? And it becomes this big conversation around measurement shouldn't be done in an event-based system. It should be kind of happening all the time because learning happens all the time, and we need to create opportunities for students to showcase that. And like you mentioned, David, it's not like every single student in my class, 35 kids in my class, are going to be all at the same place at the same time. That's an impossible, naive expectation to have, yet it's how we move through. But I think when we pull back just to that demonstration of learning model and students, in Kentucky, I see a lot they're kind of having benchmark moments in second grade and fifth grade and ninth grade, et cetera. Like they're doing it based around like transitions from buildings, oftentimes are great places and times to benchmark. But I think fundamentally it has to go one step further. Yes, we can do the showcase. But where I always want to talk to the schools about is what students put into the showcase matters. And if we're not creating learning experiences where a student can show their process and they're just uploading or showcasing rather things like worksheets that they've done, well, then we have an issue because that is still transactional in nature, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it absolutely is. And yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that is so important. And that is why I think if you think about this from a systems perspective and why the benchmarking at second and fifth and eighth and 12th and whatever you want to talk about it, if the system isn't doing that together so that fifth grade teacher or the fourth grade teacher and the fifth grade teacher don't understand what they've been doing with their learners, so that in other words, each level has to know what happened before, and you have to ensure, and I think that is a crucial element of this, you have to ensure that what's coming into those defenses of learning is rigorous and it's meaningful stuff, which is why things like project-based learning and other things like that have become so important, because those are the things that demonstrate that application of knowledge. It's the stepping stone from, I know one of my former commissioners, Jason Glass, who's still in education, he's a superintendent, but he was our commissioner, and he talked about it at a board meeting one time when they said, well, we got to know that kids know the Pythagorean theorem. Yes, of course we have to know that they know the Pythagorean theorem. We'll give that as a given. But do we report that to the world and compare it to the next school and how many kids got the Pythagorean? No, what's important is, can you show me what in a real life problem solving mode it looks like to use the Pythagorean theorem to solve a problem? Not a problem that's in a textbook or on a test, but here's this thing that I need you to solve. And the fact that if you've done your job well as a teacher and as a school system, that student can look at that problem and go, I need to use the Pythagorean theorem for this. The fact that they know that is part of so that process of learning that ends in a defense of learning is a demonstration of you doing your job in helping them understand conceptually how things work, and then them showing you in a very high level, rigorous way, this is what I did that in using those things you taught me. I built a new whatever. I did this. I created something that was a creation of mine and not something I learned in a textbook. That's so much deeper than what we do now. It's not even in the same universe. That if you're getting kids to that place of, oh, I know what I'm doing here. I'm taking these concepts that my teacher taught me, and I'm using them. And that's what the defense does. That's a well-designed defense system not only shows the process, but shows that I know how the content fits into that process. So,
Funny that you mentioned the Pythagorean theorem, because one of the things that I really love seeing is when we infuse frameworks together. And I do see it a lot on district sites. They have their portrait and they talk all about it on one section of their site. And then they have, all their different curriculum areas, and they kind of keep them separate instead of having that broader infusion. And a lot of what you just mentioned that was resonating with me was the connection to the real world application. And then I'm thinking, well, career readiness, and everybody is having these vast career readiness frameworks going on, but again, they're kind of living parallel to each other instead of being infused, right? And this is the perfect opportunity. And I was having a conversation with a friend of mine last week, and David, I was talking about, the work that we're doing, and Pythagorean theorem came up, and he laughed and he said to me, and he goes, I use it every day. He works in landscape design. And he's like, I have to use it every single day of my life. He's like, however, if when I was in ninth grade learning that, if there was ever a teacher that would have helped me understand that Pythagorean theorem was going to be something that I would use when I was an adult every single day, he's like, you think I would have paid a bit more attention in those classes and cared a bit more and wanted to succeed. He's like, whether or not I knew that this is what I was going to land on, if I would have been able to see that application, it would have changed my approach, right? So I feel like that's also something that a lot of school systems need to consider is when they're bringing out any of these initiatives, instead of looking at them in parallel, how do you work with your department heads to just have broad infusion, right? So that way it just is a part of everything.
And again, that to me, Jordan, that goes back to sort of what we began with and what I've thought about through all of this conversation. And that is the system, again, has to support the ideas that you just described. And if the system isn't, we have lots and lots and lots of places where superintendents, principals, and teachers have embraced these models that we're talking about. They've embraced, more competency-based, whatever project-based that you're thinking about. But here's what happens. They go along and they do that, and they're helping kids develop the learning process, and they're learning and they're showing their work across time. And then they got to stop so that the kid can take their math test. That's what I mean about spread, that there's going to become a halt when you get to the set of teachers that will do something if they believe it's really going to be different in this way that they're supported, and not. And so if your system is not supporting and believing in this work, then that's going to happen. You're going to get to that place where people aren't willing to live for two masters, if you will, right? They're not going to live in the transactional system and the relational system. They'd love to live in the relational system, but they got to deal with the transactions that have to occur. And everything is about, as you pointed out, I think you said this a little earlier, it's about, did I get the curriculum in time? Did I get that work done? And so.
A lot of things to unpack, but as we are wrapping up the conversation here today, David, why do you see frameworks like the Portrait of a Learner being critical to the future of K-12 education?
Because again, to our point earlier, Jordan, if it's sort of like, it's about this, which is on foundation and which is on top of, it's sort of a flip. If you focus your energy primarily at all levels of the system on making sure you have developed learners, then whatever it is they're trying to learn, they can learn. If you've done that, if you in parallel brought those things along together from the beginning. So again, going back to the idea that you have to have indicators all the way up the system from K through 12. If you're doing that, if teachers are teaching kids age appropriate, this is the things that you need to be able to do as a learner. Oh, and by the way, we're learning it. Did you just notice we're learning this because I'm teaching you some math or I'm teaching you some science, but what I'm really doing is teaching you how to learn. And if the portrait becomes this is a broad, bold, radical statement. The portrait becomes our curriculum standards. The portrait becomes the value proposition for teachers. If I've made learners, if I've created or helped facilitate the learner, then that means that I've probably done a decent job of teaching them whatever content the state needs me to teach them. I've just done it from a different perspective. I've done it from my relationship with that kid and facilitating their ability to learn, not just, okay, we're here to get to May and we're here to check the boxes of the transactions we need to take, the tests, the quizzes, the homework, the things that we need to do to get kids to that end result. And then unfortunately, what happens in the system in most places is, so you give a kid a third grade math test, and then we don't really do a good job of, well, if Jordan didn't learn his third grade math, then the fourth grade teacher's being told, you got to start with fourth grade math and teach fourth grade math, right? And wait a minute, I got 4 kids in my classroom who didn't get third grade math.
Right.
But if I taught them how to learn, there's probably ways I could help those kids progress to grade level while I'm doing my other stuff for the kids that were already there. So anyway.
Today, we're talking about system transformation, moving learning from a transaction to one of a relationship to help facilitate students' ability to learn and be future ready. David, thank you so much for joining us here on the show today. We're super appreciative of the time.
Glad to be here, Jordan. It was wonderful. It was good talking to you.
That was system transformer and former director of innovative learning for the Kentucky Department of Education, David Cook. Hey, thanks for listening to the show, and please make sure to hit the follow button on your podcast app so you never miss an episode. I'm Jordan Lewis, and you've been listening to the Growth Over Grades podcast.